Okay. Hello, everyone. Hopefully, my stuff is functional. So, I'm Christine Tomlinson. I'm your host, and this is I Have Thoughts On. This is our first episode, and today we're going to be discussing history in games. So, I'd like to bring in my guests now and have everyone introduce themselves. All right. So, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. So, we'll just go around and give some quick introductions before we hop into our conversation. And why don't we start with Julie, if that's all right?
Hi there, my name is Julie Levy. I am an independent scholar. I have two higher degrees in ancient Mediterranean studies, mostly focused on ancient Greece and Rome, particularly the historical linguistics aspect, comparative history, that sort of stuff. Also, strongly interested in Sappho. Um, I have also been and would love to send as many people as I can towards the Save Ancient Studies Alliance. I was part of their mission for 3 years. Um, they do really good work making classics accessible for everybody, and in particular, um, I just want to shout out they're about to start their birthday bash, which is a big fundraiser. So if you are interested in history and gaming and making ancient history sort of a fun mainstream place that people can go, please do go head over to that. Sorry for the the little promo there. I'm also an Archeo gamer myself. I do um, have a YouTube and a Twitch channel. The Twitch channel is at Zillable. That's syllable with a Z. And I do live streams of video games that have ancient stuff in them, and I talk about it most Saturdays at 3 p.m. Eastern. It's a little bit derailed at the moment just for logistical reasons, but it will be back shortly. Um, and also, my YouTube channel is Zilla's Athenaeum, where I talk a lot about ancient history, ancient linguistics, board game media reviews, leftist politics, whatever is current. Thank you so much for having me here, Christine. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Julie. Stephen, why don't we go to you next?
And last, I've been making video games or making games of one type or another because it started with tabletop games. I've been making games for around 30 years now. I started off as a writer for Games Workshop, the makers of all the Warhammer universes, and then moved after a while eventually into AAA. I worked on several Assassin's Creed games, a bunch of other stuff. And then a couple years ago, I packed all of that in to do my own little thing. And my own thing is making a game about Welsh mythology, which is narrated entirely in the Welsh language. So it's about as far away from AAA development as you can get. It's the game is called Tales from the Mabinogion, and the Mabinogion, if you don't know, and you probably don't know because no one outside of Wales knows, in academia, is a medieval Welsh text. It's a mythological text, well, mythological fantasy, for some people, even a religious text, which was hugely influential on contemporary fantasy, but there's nobody's heard of it. So I decided to make a game about that. So that's a kind of like super brief summary of my past 30 years.
Awesome. Thank you for that, and welcome. And Ray, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, Christine. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me on. My name is Ray Kimball. I'm a retired history faculty member. I taught first year survey courses in Western Civ and Russian history. Now that I'm retired, I run an educational games coaching business that I work with higher ed and corporate folks who want to bring games into their learning spaces but don't really know how to do so, what's a valid game for learning, things like that. I've been the lead author and lead editor for two educational role-playing games, one about the Cuban Missile Crisis and one about the Royal Society's debates over Darwin's theories of natural selection in the 19th century. And finally, I serve as the development editor for the Reacting Consortium, which is an organization that promotes educational role-playing games in multiple venues, including both high schools and higher education. And as their development editor, I've helped to bring forward now 15 different educational role-playing games, most of them in a historical setting.
Very cool. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. I'm also going to try to keep an eye on the chat in case there are any questions. I do see some dancing dinos, so thank you for that, chat. But we can go ahead and dive into things. So to start us off, I just want to ask all of you what your thoughts are when you hear historical game or when you hear history in games. What immediately comes to mind? What do you think of? Like, what sort of reaction do you have?
This is Ray. I'll lead off. I get very excited about it because I think games are an amazing way to get people excited about the practice of history. Unfortunately, for so many people, their introduction to history at whatever level, primary, high school, whatever the case may be, their exposure is history is just one darn thing after another. It's memorizing dates, it's memorizing names, and not really appreciating the complexity of history as a discipline, appreciating the agency of interactions, appreciating just how difficult it is to say with any kind of authority what actually happened, even in recent history, let alone like in fields like Julie's field of ancient history. And so I get very excited when I hear history in games, because to me, it is a way of getting people excited about the discipline in ways that are really actually difficult to do.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in because so this is a question that I think if you asked me 2 years ago, it would be a wildly different response to the kind of response that I have in mind now. I think a couple of years ago, like if you said a history game, it would be a game that's about historical places, about historical timelines, about simulating historical systems, political or social or military systems. That's kind of like what people think of as history games. The past couple of years, I've been working a lot more directly with historians and hanging out in kind of history gaming communities. And that's really changed my perception of what it means to be like a history game. I think there's one game in particular that really transformed things for me because it kept coming up in discussions all the time in like history groups and talking with historians is the Outer Wilds. The Outer Wilds, if you look at it kind of superficially, this is a sci-fi game about, it's a space exploration puzzle solving game, right? This is not history. This has got nothing to do with this. But in actual fact, what you're doing in the game is you're piecing a story together, you're piecing events together by looking at fragmentary evidence, right? Which is history. That's exactly what historians do. And so, historians talk about this game a lot because it's a game about what historians do. So I think now, like my perception of history games has become more kind of, I look at it the lens of, does this game make me feel like I'm doing what an historian would be doing? Right. And in one way, like when you're playing in historical locations and you're playing historical timelines and playing with historical systems, you're doing that because historians also do that, right? But it's not just limited to that. It's also games which make you think like an historian thinks. Games like The Outer Wilds.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, you phrased that two different ways, and I have two completely different reactions. Right? So there's the history games. The reaction I have to that, like I start thinking about, games that are very firmly grounded in some amount of history, like an Assassin's Creed where they do a lot of work on the setting and, they have an educational mode, or games like the Oregon Trail, right? Which is, very, very much about a historical experience. But when you say history in games, as an Archeo gamer, the one thing I've learned is that every game has history in it, right? Like, so Archeo gaming is kind of a new field in the the scheme of things. Basically, it's what we would otherwise call reception studies, media reception, where you have history and you see how it is received in modern media, or some other period's media. And this is a sort of a new subset of that. But what we do end up talking about a lot is just what Stephen was talking about, where Outer Wilds is something we talk about a ton because you're doing archaeology, you're doing this observation, this understanding of the history of your own surroundings and learning from it. For me, the touchstone is this game called Heaven's Vault, which is a wonderful indie game by Inkle Studios that I have a deep love for, where the main gameplay is epigraphy, which is a word that most people don't know what it means, right? Because it's such a specialized archaeology term. What it is the study of inscriptions. So the main gameplay in Heaven's Vault is you're trying to translate an ancient language. You're trying to learn it so that you can read it, so that you can understand what happened to bring your galaxy, your nebula, about. It's a complete sci-fi setting. None of the places are real places. None of the cultures there are real cultures, although they have elements of them. But what you're doing is you're engaging in archaeological practice in the game, and specifically linguistic practice. So when you have, you can have all sorts of games with archaeological or historical influence on them in completely different ways. Like you get everything from Hades, where you are right in the mythology and the history doesn't matter too much because it's about the gods and the fantasy of it. You can have a game where it's completely divorced from our real world cultures, but you're doing history. But there are other things too, like you can be playing Animal Crossing and building a museum, right? Filling it out with these cultural artifacts. There's even this is one of my favorite things that we were talking about Ludo History earlier, another Archeo gaming streamer. My favorite thing that Adam's ever introduced me to is Doom Museum. Which is you are Doom Guy. You have the Doom Guy set up from the old classic Doom game, and you're walking around, and instead of a gun, you've got like a glass of wine. Instead of a health meter, you've got a cheese meter. You are at a reception at an ancient history museum, looking around at all the cool stuff, and it's like actual artifacts that are found. I think it's in the Getty in California. It's who would have thought, right? So history in games is everywhere. It's everything. It's huge. It's everything I want to do. But historical games are a narrower subset.
Yeah, so given that there are so many different ways to approach this and different ways to experience history as part of games, whether that's designed history to sort of better understand mythology or actual history, and I do think the blending of those two so frequently is very interesting, and if you want to add on to that, I would really enjoy it. But something else that I've looked into is this idea of history as sort of a feeling, one of those aesthetic experiences that, yeah, it can be a gateway to learning, but it's also part of fun gameplay. And there are a lot of things, like with reception studies, like you point out, Julie, a lot of things need to be done to make it still engaging and interesting. But you have some people who are very interested in the accuracy. You have a lot of people who this opens the door for them to actually start studying some of the background and sources for these things. So what do you think about accuracy versus that emotional aesthetic connection or feeling in reaction to gameplay?
Yeah, I'm just gonna talk, be vaguely relevant to your question, but maybe not exactly after it. One of the things when working on a game and how history fits into it is really it comes back to the core fantasy of the game, right? So if you take an Assassin's Creed, like the core fantasy that you have there is live an adventure in an historical time in an historical place, right? If you wanted to sum up the fantasy that Assassins is selling, it's that. So in that context, you need to have that historical authenticity, so it feels like an historical time and an historical place, right? That's what you're selling. In another game, I mentioned very briefly when we were talking before, For Honor, which a lot of people would not consider a historical game at all, but the core fantasy there is fight like an historical warrior, right? Fight like a samurai or a knight or a Viking. So there, like the core fantasy, it doesn't matter. The architecture doesn't matter. The narrative doesn't matter, right? What matters is that when you're fighting, you feel like an historical warrior fighting. So they very deliberately, it was a game I worked on as well. There are no, kind of fancy anime style moves. There's no magic powers, right? The game, we used HEMA, historical European martial arts actors, for mocapping the moves, right? With this kind of aim to be at least plausibly authentic, right, in terms of the combat. And that's not something that you need in Assassin's Creed, right? In Assassin's Creed, you can have people jumping off buildings and you can have aliens as long as the architecture is respected, as long as the clothing that the crowds have is respected. So I guess it's kind of coming back to your question that, what kind of level of authenticity do you need? It's what you're selling to the player, right? If you're selling to the player that we're going to be in this historical time, in this historical place, you need to be able to sell that historical time and historical place. If you're selling them, you're going to fight like an historical warrior, you need to sell, you need to be authentic in terms of what it's like to be an historical warrior.
That reminds me, I mean, really what we're talking about is immersion, right? It's the buy-in that we get from the player of a game. What is the immersion point that we're looking for? And you can get different types of that, right? Like you were saying about, what are you selling them? What is the experience that you're going for here? Are you selling them authenticity, historical accuracy? Are you selling them a fantasy? Are you selling them a learning experience? And this keeps reminding me of older style edutainment games when we were like first experimenting with the video game in the classroom thing. And I wonder if Ray can speak more to this as somebody who developed games for the classroom. Um, but like those have a reputation, right? And it's not a good one. There's no immersion is the problem. It's like it's too tied to this educational principles angle. And so when you're trying to figure out like what the important thing is for a historical game, you need to figure out what part of the history you're trying to sell. Like if you want something like Sailing the Seas, which is meant to be as accurate as possible to an ancient merchant vessel in the Aegean in, I can't remember the exact year they were talking about, but like it's ancient Greece, like merchant vessel with as much accuracy as we can manage, down to the point where they were looking for lyrics from poems by Sappho for somebody to try and sing that, so that you have that just in the background of like, this is real as we can make it. Are you selling them that immersion? Or are you selling them the immersion of fight like an ancient warrior, fight like a samurai? Are you selling them, look at this world, look at revolutionary Boston as it really existed? Are you telling them, learn the powers of the gods by using them? Are you selling them, like, what are you going for? It's kind of like translation. You can never translate one-to-one between languages perfectly. They don't work like that. You're always having to choose, am I going for the most literal translation, if that's even possible, or am I going for the most emotionally evocative, the most, on the same wavelength, are the vibes in sync kind of translation? What do you want to give? And those translations both have value, right? You want an Emily Wilson or a Maria Devana Headley to have Beowulf going, bro, to get people into the story and feel like they're in a pub being told this like weird ass story about dragons. But you also want the very literal translation to be able to study it and see what they were doing with their poetic technique. So it's not an either or thing. There is no perfect pasta sauce.
Yeah, Julie, you mentioned those early games. There was an infamous metaphor that was applied to those, which was chocolate covered broccoli, which was the idea of, okay, if we put the shiny shell on the outside, we'll get kids to be able to take it in. And infamously, one of the big games conferences, Games Learning and Society, actually served chocolate covered broccoli as a dessert, and the consensus was that it was disgusting. So yeah, I feel that entirely. Look, Stephen and Julie have spoken really, really well on the idea of authenticity and experience. I want to go a slightly different direction, which is authenticity of outcomes. And this is a critique that gets leveled at historical games, which is, well, what if the outcome of the game isn't what really happened in history? Well, of course, first there's the challenge of what really happened, and the fact that historians are constantly arguing about that and reinterpreting it. The idea here that I find that is really helpful in thinking about this is a concept called the plausibility corridor that comes from an author named Nicholas Proctor, who writes a number of educational role-playing games. And the idea of the plausibility corridor is the idea that a historical game should have outcomes that could conceivably have happened, given all of the confluences of the factors that are at work, given individual decisions, and yes, even random chance, and the impact that all of those can have. And so as long as your game falls within that plausibility corridor, that you're not necessarily doing damage, it's certainly not a bad thing. Now, if it's a learning game, and I think it's helpful to differentiate between a learning game and a game for entertainment, if it's a learning game, I think it is helpful to have at some point where you say, okay, here's what we think happened based on the best of our knowledge. And again, to me, that falls well within that idea of the plausibility corridor.
Yeah, just to follow up on the plausibility corridor thing, one of the things I really like about like the Civ games, for example, or oh, I forgot the name of it. There's some game where you're like playing through the Prussian Wars. In Civ, it is perfectly normal for, you know, Otto von Bismarck to build Stonehenge, right? Like, these things make no sense. You know, you can go to war with Gandhi, famously. You know, this stuff, it doesn't break your immersion in the game because you're not looking for that experience.
Probably cannot be in there as well, because we talk about plausibility, it's kind of plausible for whom? Because the perception of a historian, the perception of a game dev, and perception of a player are all going to be potentially wildly different things. There's an interesting thing that came up recently that I just want to kind of throw out to you guys. So the game I'm working on at the moment is set in ancient Wales. And I've done a lot of research on the ecology of ancient Wales to try and make the game feel like ancient Wales. And then I start getting Welsh people to play it. And some of the first comments I got were, this doesn't feel like Wales, right? Because the ecology has changed so much in the past 1,000 years. I mean, literally, there's the entire forest land in Wales at the moment has been planted within the past 100 years, right? There's almost none of the ancient forest remains anymore. And so you get this kind of weird sort of situation. And the same kind of thing happened with music. You know, I'm trying to put music in the game that respects kind of 1,000-year-old musical traditions. Contemporary Welsh folk music is very much based on harp and voice, which are kind of like 18th, 19th century development. So people hear the music and they're like, this doesn't, you say this is supposed to be traditional Welsh music, but it doesn't sound like traditional Welsh music, right? And these are like, Welsh people that are saying this. So you run into this kind of interesting tension where it's like, I want to make the game authentic, but in making it authentic, people feel like it's inauthentic, right? Because it doesn't meet their expectations of what Wales should be like, what Welsh ecosystem should be like, what Welsh music should be like. And so you have to find a, do you look for a kind of balance between the two? Me, I'm just, and in these cases, it's kind of, I'm doing what I'm doing. If you question it, that's great, because now we are into an educational opportunity, right? I can explain to you the history of Welsh music and the history of Welsh ecosystems. But kind of bringing back to that original point, it just kind of highlights how different people's perceptions are. What might be plausible to a player might actually be wildly implausible to a historian.
And it's also really tricky, just you bringing up the angle of like Welsh people playing this, and like the the difficulty of cultural crossing, right? Like, you don't want to cross the line into appropriation rather than authenticity and simulation. And you get really interesting things like, well, if you want an authentic ancient Rome, like the Forgotten City is a really good example of this, of like just a very, very well researched ancient Roman town with lots of characters, with lots of like real depth to them that feel ancient Roman to me, a scholar of ancient Rome. I could very easily see people playing this game and going, why is this black woman here? Like, for example, and not even, in the like horrible chud racist kind of way, just like, where did she come from? I thought this was from Rome. And here in North America, we have this lack of visceral sense of how close Italy and North Africa are, for example, of how integrated ancient Rome really was, is very far off. There was a huge confrontation about it online. My sense of time is terrible for this. 10 years ago, like, there was a huge back and forth between Mary Beard and some right wing weirdos about, what do you mean that there were black people in Roman Britain? Like, so like it's that nobody is ancient Roman anymore. That culture is not. You don't have living people to dispute it. You just have people and their feelings about it. But something like Wales, people still live there whose ancestors would have been around at that time. And then you get things like when you're looking at chia, which is made by people from New Caledonia about New Caledonia. And you kind of, as a white person who knows nothing about New Caledonia except for its name and like a little bit about the colonization, I go into chia and I have no expectations, right? Like, I don't even know what to expect here. Do I know how New Caledonians feel about the mix of their indigenous language and the colonizer French, about the interracial relationship, about the mythology and how it's presented? I have no idea. I can only sort of view it from this distant lens, and I don't know how appropriative it is. For all I know, it gets the same kind of backlash that something like Moana did.
While we've been talking, I had this sudden image of a bunch of really angry, offended Germans going, we could build Stonehenge. Otto Bismarck could have built Stonehenge if the English didn't get there first. I was going to do that in a really ridiculous German accent, but I thought that might be getting a little too much.
Yeah, alternative histories are also kind of interesting and lean into the entertainment a little bit, reimagining history, playing with history, understanding it through different and unique lenses. I think it's something that games have that we see a little bit in other media, right? Like media has to be entertaining. We see history explored through various types of media, but it's always through a very specific approach and reimaginings and those ideas of reception studies where we sort of have to make it make sense for contemporary audiences. With all of that and everything that you've been discussing in mind, what do you think gives video games an edge when it comes to exploring history for players, or what makes games unique for this?
100%, it's the immersion, it's the agency, being able to walk around it yourself, being able to interact with it yourself. There's no other medium that we have that allows people to be in some amount of history.
I'll add in to Julie's point. I think specifically on video games, the ability to build in scaffolding to bring people in who may have zero knowledge and who may have very limited skills, and let them kind of slowly build themselves into the world and expand their ability to interact with it over time to level up as it were. I think is a huge advantage that even other forms of games really struggle with. In role-playing games, you have to have that skilled and experienced game master. If you just throw a bunch of roll sheets at people and say, immerse yourself, it doesn't work anywhere near as well as plunking people down in front of a console or on their phone and saying, go explore this world for 15 or 20 minutes and then come back to me.
Just add in there, it kind of relates to what Ray and Julie have been saying as well. I guess reach. I mean, there are many, many people that will never pick up a book and won't even watch a movie if they think it has educational value to them, but will still play a game. Whether it's because they don't realize they're being educated and you're kind of sneaking it in there, or even if they do, still it's just it's a format that there are people who will only engage with that kind of media. So it's a way to reach people that you would not be able to reach with other media.
That is a very good point. And I think part of the reason that we've seen so much push toward edutainment and educational games for exploring these kinds of topics. I'm also sort of curious though, and I'm going to take us in maybe a weird direction, but while you were talking, I was thinking about like the agency that players have, the ability to make decisions and shape things, particularly in games that sort of borrow from history. Like we can think about neo-medievalism in video games and think of a bunch of role-playing games like Dragon Age or Baldur's Gate. Baldur's Gate 3 in particular has been a huge one. How can we understand the player's role in shaping these stories and interacting with fictionalized elements of history and artifacts that become very familiar from things that you might have learned in the classroom, but are very much reconceptualized?
So I think in games, agency can actually be a really useful tool, not only in granting agency, but in where you limit the agency of the player and where you specifically put things off limits to them. I'm going to shamelessly trumpet my own work for a moment. In my Cuban Missile Crisis game, there are messaging channels that can go between particular persons, specifically between heads of state and their ambassadors, but there is no direct messaging channel between the United States and the Soviet Union because the hotline didn't exist at that time. There are no channels of any kind, diplomatic messaging or anything, between the United States and Cuba, again, because those were deliberately cut and not used during that time. And it's enormously frustrating to players in that game of, what do you mean I'm Kennedy? And what do you mean I can't just call Khrushchev? Yeah, man, that's the whole point. That was part of the problem. And you're going to have to work within that limit. And so I think the historically accurate imposition of agency can be a really powerful tool in games.
To go in a slightly different direction with this, I mean, Ray, I love talking about the limitations and constraints as a jumping point for creativity, because that is how we function, right? But when Christine was asking this question, what I was actually thinking about was like the need that we have as educators to pair skilled readings with the more agentic gameplay in order to get the most out of it. And this is, the fun part is Archeo gaming, right? Like the fun part is sitting down on Saturday to watch somebody who's an expert in Viking history play Ollie, right? Um, but like it is, I can play a game like Abzu, which, while being named for a I believe Sumerian sea deity and is in the sea, there's no dialogue in that game. There's all you're doing is exploring the ancient ruins of an underwater civilization and solving environmental puzzles and watching pretty fish. Um, and that's not what we think of as an educational game. But if what you're doing is saying, okay, if you come across this ruin, how do you analyze it? What does it tell you? You have to kind of have that pairing to make the most of a lot of games. And in particular, like you can have, well, to come back to our Germans yelling at the screen that they could absolutely build Stonehenge, um, you know, you can have that moment, but it's only funny because we all know that that didn't happen, that that doesn't make sense, right? That's not the right time period, not the right type of manufacture, not the right culture. Um, if you don't come in knowing that, then, well, agency can kind of go off the rails.
I have a lot to add to what Ray and Julie have already said. I think this is more a historian kind of question than a game dev kind of question. I think what I will say though is that having player agency, one thing it does is give ownership of the narrative to the player, right? That becomes like when you're reading a book, you are reading the author's book exclusively. When you're watching a movie, you're watching the director's vision of the movie. When you're playing a game, you have some degree of scope, depending on the game, that degree of scope changes, uh, to make that your story instead of the author's story, which is, it's a very powerful tool that games kind of uniquely have. And so I'm just wondering how much that contributes to some of the things we were saying earlier as well. How much of that being able to have that ownership is what allows people to engage with the stories that they wouldn't engage with in other ways, and allows people that wouldn't access those stories through other media to access them through video games because they get that sense of ownership.
Yeah, and like I don't want to come off like I don't think that player agency is good, because I was also saying like 100% agency is the thing that makes this work, right? So just to sort of go back, kind of bounce off Steven's point, there is like agency is the thing that makes games such a fantastic and unique educational tool, because people get to make choices. They have to form an opinion in order to make those choices, right? They need to know enough about their environment in order to interact with it. And that is a learning process. There's a reason that gamification has become such a powerful tool in all parts of our culture right now. Um, you know, in service of everything from education on the one end to horrifying capitalistic impulses on the other, right? So that human impulse to get it right, or make their own way, or make a mark on a story, or even just to like navigate a puzzle um that is set in front of them, is so important in how we as humans process the world. That nothing that is presented to you as a whole unit can really quite be the same as something where you get to choose which direction you're going through it.
One thing that I want to bring out based on Stephen and Julie's comments is that when you're talking about games as a tool for learning, and I'm setting this aside from games for entertainment, I'm not bad-mouthing games for entertainment anyway, but specifically if we're talking about games as tools for learning, what has to accompany that player agency is reflection. You cannot assume that all players, just by virtue of the fact that they all played the same game, all took the same thing away from it, right? That experience is going to be different. And there has to be a mechanism. Maybe that's a debrief with the instructor. Maybe it's a short reflective thing on their own. Any number of ways that can be done. But there's got to be an opportunity for that player to reflect on their experience and share what they got so with others, so that folks can get a sense of what they actually learned and what they took away from that game.
That's a genuine question for you here, Ray, from a non-educator, non-historian. Is that a different situation than any other media? Is that a different situation? Because it feels like you'd want the same thing from a book or a movie or even a class.
No, Stephen, I don't think it's different. But I think there is a danger with games because they are so engaging and immersive that people think they can hand wave is kind of not fair to people, that people think they can skimp on a reflective practice because they say, oh, well, this was so engaging, this was so wonderful, we don't really need to talk about it because the experience stands on its own. I've lost track of how many times I've heard that phrase used. Well, the game experience stands on its own. No, it does not. And I will die on this hill.
I'm right there with you. This is coming back to what I was thinking earlier with you have to have the pairing of the knowledge to go with the experience, or it doesn't really hit. But in particular, I was just thinking of like places where this is so often mismatched, right? People in media analysis, you can see the proliferation on something like YouTube of I think of it as the bad movie criticism problem, where people are like, oh, well, there's a continuity error in this shot. Like her braid was on one side of her face and now it's on the other one. That's a you know that's a movie mistake. Ding. And like that's not actually media criticism, right? That's just nitpicking because it's not actually analyzing anything that was part of the medium. There is no one right way to interpret a piece of media. This is what the whole about death of the author sort of thing is about, for those of you who are into lit crit. Um, but like also there can be such a mismatch between ludonarrative design and information. One particularly striking example for me was so I did a podcast episode with Movies We Dig, which is an Archeo gaming podcast, digging movies. And they wanted to talk about the Lara Croft reboot. So I played through the 2018 Tomb Raider, and then I watched the movie. So I'd have them, nice and fresh. And as I'm playing this Tomb Raider, she's supposed to be an archaeology grad student, and boy, I know what archaeology grad students are like. I know what their skill sets generally are and how they view a lot of things. And she's walking through this environment, this splendorous ancient temple, and she will occasionally open a box and go, hey, look, this is a several thousand-year-old artifact. And you get like a little pop-up that tells you what museum it's found in. You can turn it around, you can look at the whole thing, and then she stuffs it in her pocket and walks away. And like, what? Who would ever? This is is beyond Indiana Jones. What is happening here? And that is such a common failure state for games that are trying to incorporate a little bit of history without thinking about how it actually matches with the gameplay.
And I want to add on also to Ray, what you were talking about with reflection. I study a lot of like online forums and online spaces. I look at what players are saying to each other. And sort of a cool thing that happens is I do see a lot of reflection on historical games or games with some element of mythology and history in them. And players want to know more. It's obviously not all players. It's going to depend on who is coming to these forums and what their experience was like. But there is a lot of and I see in the chat, Lara Croft is a collector for the British Museum, apparently. But yeah, so there is this interest for a lot of players in understanding what's accurate, what actually happened in these mythological stories, what can we use these games to understand, and what maybe do we need another source to better understand. And so it is cool that there's an interest in that kind of reflection that you mentioned, Ray. With that in mind, I do want to ask, we see a lot of games that explore the same kinds of histories or mythologies or settings over and over again. There's been some criticism that there's so many examples of ancient Rome, for example, ancient Greece we see. But I'm curious for all of you, especially Stephen, since you're working on like Welsh mythology, something that we really haven't seen a lot of, what areas or what histories, what mythologies, what do you wish would be explored in general or more often?
Well, and in Wales, and exclusively spoken in the Welsh language. That's it. No, more seriously, any kind of minority culture, anything that we don't hear of. We've heard so much about Norse and Egyptian and Greco-Roman and this is just me personally. I want to see those other cultures, the cultures that have been historically oppressed and historically suppressed. And there's so many wonderful, beautiful stories out there that never make it because of this, the dominance of the English language and the dominance of those specific cultures. So I want to. I can't even tell you what I want to see, because what I want to see is the things I haven't heard of. Right? It's the cultures and the languages and the stories and the histories and the mythologies that we don't know about. That's what I want people to be doing more of.
Yeah, for me, I know in my work with the Reacting Consortium, one of the things that they are really pressing for is trying to get more games that are set in African, East Asian, and South Asian context, because they just don't have a lot of them. And it's not even necessarily about representation per se. It's about empowering instructors in those disciplines to be able to tap into the power of games to effectively teach their discipline, right? To teach it in a rigorous and a structured way that allows them to reach more students, to draw more students in. A student who might not be interested in an African history survey course, say, might choose to do that course if they hear that they're going to play 3 games as part of the course. That might be the thing that tips them between that and, yet another course on fill in the blank here. I'm not going to fill in that blank because I don't feel like, rousing people against me. But I think getting games in those other fields and other disciplines is a great way of drawing people towards those courses and letting them learn more about that subject.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I worked with the Save Ancient Studies Alliance for so long, is because it really is focused on trying to make global ancient history more accessible. And one problem that we repeatedly encountered in trying to find games to play on the Archeo Gaming streams, courses to make with the Archeo Gaming team, is that while there are a couple of cases of games of really interesting, underserved, underrepresented places. It reflects in a lot of ways the colonial education that has been so prominent in the same cultures that have produced the most video games, right? So when you get 30, 40 games about Rome to every one game about anywhere in East Asia, that's not surprising given how structured our education is to impart those biases. People know from a young age the mythology of Greece. They might recently have started getting interested in Korean mythology because K-pop Demon Hunters came out, right? Like that's a bigger problem than just video games. That's a cultural level problem. But I do think that as game dev tools are becoming more accessible, we are starting to see more games from unique environments that we don't hear about a ton. Games like Chia and Never Alone. I'm blanking on the name of that game set in West Africa, but it is so good. Um, but like there's just a ton of things that we could do, and if we make them popular in the video games, then maybe that will start to bleed into other parts of mainstream culture, because ancient history belongs to everybody the same way that modern history does. And that's a divide that you see a lot in history, of like people think, okay, well, ancient history is just Greece and Rome, maybe Egypt, maybe ancient China. And it's like, no, ancient history is everywhere because were everywhere. It's a lot about the inherent bias of living in the culture that we do, of English being the lingua franca of the British Empire, where the sun never set, and the similar projects of the colonial US, of Japanese imperialism, Austrian imperialism. Everywhere that you have these imperial projects, it twists things afterwards. And I think one of the big projects that we as educators and as game devs and really as people who are interested in the cultural view of education, of the world, in any way, shape, or form, one of our big projects has to be saying, hey, that map isn't actually accurate. Did you know map projections exist and do different things? Did you know translation isn't one-to-one? This is a big part of what I've always seen as the core of why I'm interested in educating people at all, is saying, hey, the assumptions you have about how isolated you are in the world are incorrect. History is, it's not so much a foreign country as just, people were still people then. It's not some age of heroes and monsters any more than now is.
And we have in the chat, someone says, one of the sad things is that repeats of Rome and Greece will sell and other lesser known settings might not, due to a lack of immediate familiarity, which is probably one of those pressures going on behind the scenes as well.
It absolutely is. And that's why you're seeing such a boom of fantastic indie games of such spectacular variety that you really don't see in AAA.
Kind of worth stating explicitly, and it's one of my personal kind of motivations in my current project, which is increasingly games. It's becoming capable of I have to say that, being cultural records in themselves, being items of cultural preservation, right? When we think of what preserves culture, we think of books, artifacts, all kinds of different things, even movies more recently. But increasingly, games are able to step into that role. But they're only able to step into that role if cultures are being represented so that they can be preserved like that, right? It's a very weak form of cultural preservation if it can only preserve the dominant cultures, right? So again, it's another reason why I'd like to see more of these minority culture representation in games is to be able to see games being used in that kind of way, to see games being developed as tools of cultural preservation.
And just to bring that back around, Stephen, to in particular your game, the preservation of Welsh language is such an inherently political and joyful thing, right? Because it was outlawed for so long. One of my partner's parents, for lack of a better word, is a Welsh man who was, when he was a boy, he was not allowed to speak Welsh in school, and has dedicated his life to teaching in Welsh, teaching math, I think it was, in Welsh. It's not that he wants to teach people Welsh, it's that he wants his language to be preserved. And so a game like Tales from the Mabinogion is super important as a piece of cultural preservation of an oppressed language. And that is exactly the kind of thing that I think we really can do with pushing from the indie into the mainstream. It's also a worry, though, because digital artifacts are so vulnerable, right? Because when we get to talking about preservation and archiving, we really have to look at games are not historically well preserved. Oh, pardon me. But like this is one of the big problems in I'll call it ludoarchaeology. The actual physical record keeping of games. There's so much lost media already. And now that everything is moving away from even having physical cartridges, and it's so much, just stream and digital, it's so hard to make sure that we preserve this piece of culture. I'm kind of getting off into the weeds. We can take it back around, but I just wanted to bring that up as like the preservation piece is so critical as we move forward. It's critical that we maintain it actively.
Yeah, and I want to note someone in chat also is saying it makes the case for game preservation all the more important because these games can tell important stories and introduce us to things that maybe we had never heard of that have been hidden by typical venues for understanding, exploring, and learning history. So in our very last tiny bit of time, I have one more quick question for each of you. If you could recommend one game with historical elements, settings, or content that you feel like everyone should play, what game would that be?
Am I allowed to say Tales from the Mabinogion? If not, the other one, just because I think is one of the greatest games of all time, Civilization. Pretty much any version. Well, maybe not the most recent one. The most recent one is, but any version up to the most recent one, they're all masterpieces. They're all very educational in their own way. Also, if you've never played a Civilization game before, play a Civilization game.
Stephen, thank you for giving us permission for shameless self-promotion. I'm going to likewise pile on and give one my own, Eyeball to Eyeball, the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I think it actually has amazing relevancy for the current day world as well. I will also say just the classic Oregon Trail and seeing what the designers did with just a very basic platform and how much engagement and how much content they were actually able to fit into that game.
Well, I've already given my plug for Heaven's Vault, but that would definitely be my pick if I can only choose one. But the maybe even more real answer for me is whatever game you love. Find out what's historical about it. Dig into it. Do research.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate you joining me for this first episode of I Have Thoughts On, and thank you, audience, for your questions, your participation, and for joining us for this conversation as well. Hopefully, I will see you for the next one. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, everybody.